some women do not chase. They stand still in a world addicted to movement. And yet, somehow, they are never forgotten. When she stopped reaching, the air itself seemed to change. He could no longer feel her presence circling him like a soft orbit of reassurance. There was only silence, not cold, not cruel, just complete. And in that completeness, something in him began to stir. At first, he mistook it for relief, then for confusion, then for a kind of ache that had no language. The ache of a mirror disappearing. For so long she had been the mirror, reflecting back his worth, his significance, his story. Every word she spoke to soothe him, every question she asked to understand him, every attempt to bridge the emotional gap, it all fed him the sense that he mattered. He did not notice that this sense was borrowed. He mistook her care for chemistry, her patience for proof, her fear of abandonment for devotion. And she mistook his comfort for connection. Both were caught in the same dream, the dream of being completed by another. Carl Jung wrote that when two people meet, it is never merely two individuals who meet, but two psychic systems, each filled with ghosts, ancestors, and forgotten desires. Their love was not between two people. It was between two unconscious histories trying to remember themselves. She was raised in the language of pursuit. She learned early that love had to be chased, that affection was the prize of endurance. When people pulled away, she followed. When they went silent, she filled the silence with explanation. When they withheld, she believed that if she just loved harder, they would finally stay. But each chase drained her a little more. Each silence she filled took her further from herself. She didn't know that what she was chasing wasn't him. It was the feeling of safety that vanished the day she learned love could leave. The first time he withdrew, she felt panic bloom like a storm beneath her ribs. Her mind spun stories. He's losing interest. He's meeting someone else. I did something wrong. So she reached out, tried to fix, tried to prove. And in doing so, she unknowingly fed a pattern, one as old as her own heartbeat. Her unconscious had found its familiar dance partner, rejection. But the psyche, when it repeats, is not being cruel, it is being loyal. It repeats what is unhealed until it is seen. He, too, was trapped in repetition. His mother's emotional distance had taught him that love is suffocating when it comes too close. So when she offered warmth, he recoiled. When she sought closeness, he felt invaded. When she chased, he ran, not away from her, but away from the ghosts that followed her. To him, intimacy meant danger. To her, distance meant danger. Together, they danced the ancient polarity of attachment. One pursued, one withdrew. The anxious met the avoidant, and together they called it chemistry. 4 months, this dance continued. A cycle of reaching and retreating, apology and confusion, longing and exhaustion. Until one evening, something inside her shifted. It wasn't a loud moment. It wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet recognition that she could no longer keep bleeding herself to prove she was worthy of being loved. She saw herself clearly, the endless explaining, the overthinking, the nights of waiting for replies that never came. And she realized, this is not love. This is fear wearing love's clothing. The awareness landed softly, but it carried the weight of years. Her hands, once desperate to hold on, unclenched. In the language of Jung, this was the beginning of individuation, the process of withdrawing projections and returning to one's own center. For the first time, she saw that the man before her was not her salvation, but her reflection. He mirrored every part of her that still believed she needed to chase to be chosen. And so she stopped. She stopped explaining. She stopped proving. She stopped performing emotional acrobatics to earn the bare minimum of reciprocity. Not in anger, but in awakening. The next day, the silence between them stretched. He noticed it like one notices a missing heartbeat. No messages. No, good morning. No, did I do something wrong? At first, his ego smirked, she's finally given up. Then, as the hours passed, something quieter spoke beneath his pride. Or maybe she's finally seen me. For the first time, he realized that her attention had been the ground beneath his feet. Without it, he was floating, untethered, uncertain, unimportant. And the truth hit him with the sharpness of a mirror shattering. He had mistaken her chase for love because he had never loved himself enough to be still. Meanwhile, within her, a different transformation unfolded. The silence that once terrified her began to feel like oxygen. She no longer felt the compulsion to fill space with effort. She began to sense her own presence again, the way the air felt against her skin, the rhythm of her breath, the calm after constant proving. It was as if a fog had lifted. And in its clearing she saw herself, not as someone unchosen, but as someone returning. The ego, Jung said, resists death. And for her ego, chasing had been survival. To stop chasing felt like dying. But beneath that death was life, raw, unconditioned, real. As she sat in her own company, emotions rose like tides. Grief, anger, nostalgia, relief, all speaking at once. She didn't push them away. She let them move through her. For the first time, she was not running from her feelings. She was witnessing them. The feminine, in her purest essence, is receptive, not passive, but aware. To chase is to leave that essence, to abandon the body's wisdom for the mind's illusion of control. She had lived in pursuit for so long that stillness felt foreign. But in stillness, she discovered sovereignty. Her worth was not a transaction. Her love was not a currency. Her silence was not punishment. It was prayer. He began to sense this, not through words, but through energy. Something about her had changed. The warmth was still there, but it was no longer directed at him. It had turned inward. He found himself checking his phone, wondering if she would reach out. Days passed. She didn't. And the quiet grew heavy. The mind that once enjoyed being chased now began to miss her presence. Because absence, when filled with awareness, becomes its own message. He realized he had never truly seen her, only the reflection of himself in her devotion. Now that reflection was gone. She didn't know any of this. She wasn't waiting for him to care. She wasn't hoping for a return. She was simply learning to be with herself, not the self he needed, not the self she performed, but the self beneath it all. Each morning felt like rediscovery. Each moment of solitude, a quiet revolution. She was not becoming someone new, she was remembering who she had always been. And in remembering, she dissolved the pursuit. For the first time, she understood. When you chase, you declare lack. When you rest, you declare wholeness. The universe mirrors the frequency of your being, not your wanting. And so, by doing nothing, by simply being, she was finally doing everything. The chase had ended. The healing had begun. Silence changes a man. Not quickly, not loudly, but in slow, invisible ways that unsettle the ego and awaken the soul. He begins to feel her absence like gravity reversed. Where there was once the steady pull of her attention, now there is weightless space. At first, he moves through it with pride, convincing himself he prefers the freedom. But freedom, when unearned, soon tastes like emptiness. He wonders what she's doing. He tells himself he doesn't care. And yet, every small reminder, the smell of coffee, a phrase she once used, a familiar song, stirs something wordless beneath his skin. The unconscious has no mercy for denial. Men like him are often taught to chase goals, not feelings. They conquer, acquire, perform, but rarely pause to meet the landscape of their own hearts. When a woman chases them, it allows them to keep living at the surface, to remain unexamined. Her pursuit becomes a cushion between him and his own emptiness. But when she withdraws, the cushion disappears. He meets himself, unfiltered, unadored, unrescued. And that meeting, though terrifying, is the beginning of consciousness. Within every man lives an image of the feminine, the anima, Jung called it, the inner woman, the emotional soul, the voice of intuition and empathy. If he has never faced her, he will look for her in women outside himself. He will crave her energy, her softness, her warmth, yet fear being consumed by it. He will want her to mother his inner boy and desire her to adore the man he pretends to be. This was his pattern with her. He saw in her what he could not access in himself: sensitivity, depth, emotional courage. He loved her for it, but also envied it, because every quality he admired in her reflected what he had exiled within himself. When she stopped chasing, that reflection disappeared. He could no longer outsource his soul. He had to meet his own anima, the silent, emotional self he had ignored for years. At first, he resisted. He distracted himself with work, friends, noise. But at night, when the distractions faded, the emptiness returned, not as loneliness, but as an invitation. It asked, "Who are you when no one is validating you? What remains when attention fades?" These questions had no quick answers, only echoes. And in those echoes, he began to feel what she had felt all along, the ache of disconnection. Across the unseen space between them, she too was shifting. She was not aware of his inner struggle. She was too busy tending to her own. For even in her newfound silence, old voices still whispered, "Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe you're too much. Maybe you should have tried harder." But she recognized them now. They were not truth, they were trauma. They were the inherited echoes of generations of women taught that love is labor. So she breathed through them. She didn't silence the voices, she witnessed them, and in doing so, they lost their power. Awareness changes the quality of pain. What once felt like rejection now felt like redirection. She began to see her longing not as weakness but as wisdom, a compass pointing her inward. Every time she wanted to reach out, she paused. Every time she wanted to explain, she exhaled. And slowly, the impulse to chase transformed into the ability to receive. In that receiving, she began to sense her own inner masculine, the animus, the principle of structure and action within the feminine psyche. He was not the man outside her, but the balance inside her, the part that could protect her softness without closing it. She realized that what she had sought in him was, in truth, her own unclaimed strength. Jung wrote that the encounter between anima and animus within the self is the true marriage, the inner union that ends the outer chase. And so, as she found her inner masculine, the need for him lessened. Not because she stopped loving, but because she stopped needing his reflection to feel whole. This subtle internal shift radiated outward. Her posture changed, her energy steadied, her presence deepened. Even without words, she now carried the quiet power of someone rooted in herself. And that, more than any message, any chase, any performance, was what he felt across the distance. He began to remember small details, the tone of her voice when she laughed, the way her eyes softened when she listened. These memories surfaced not to haunt him but to humble him. He realized he had been adored by someone who saw him more deeply than he had ever seen himself. And he had turned away from that mirror because he wasn't ready to face what it showed. The masculine ego fears reflection because reflection demands responsibility. It is easier to call the feminine too emotional than to admit one's own emotional illiteracy. It is easier to flee than to feel. But the soul is patient. It waits. And sometimes it waits through loss. He started to notice the hollowness of his distractions. Conversations felt shallow. Flirtations, mechanical. Success, fleeting. He realized that what he missed was not her attention. It was the feeling of being seen. The feminine had offered him that gift freely, and he had mistaken it for weakness. Now he longed for it, but not to consume it, to understand it. He wanted to know how she could feel so deeply without collapsing. How she could now walk away without bitterness. How silence could hold more power than pleading. This longing was new. It was not the hunger of the ego but the call of the soul. He felt drawn not to possess her, but to grow into someone worthy of the kind of presence she embodied. He didn't know the word for it, but he was beginning his own descent, the hero's inward journey, the confrontation with his shadow. His shadow whispered of arrogance, fear, and dependency. It showed him all the ways he had used attention as armor. And he saw clearly that her chase had protected him from facing himself. Now that it was gone, he stood naked before his own truth. Meanwhile, she found peace in the simplicity of ordinary days. The beauty of solitude no longer frightened her, it restored her. She realized that stillness didn't mean abandonment, it meant alignment. For the first time in her life, she felt safe in her own company. And that safety was magnetic. Because when a woman stops radiating anxiety, her energy becomes sacred. She becomes a mirror not for a man's validation, but for his evolution. He began to sense this too, though he could not name it. He only knew that something about her presence, even from afar, now commanded respect. He found himself replaying moments, wondering what it would feel like to meet her again, not as the half-awake man he was, but as the conscious one he could become. For the first time, his care was born not of loss but of reverence. Yet she no longer needed his recognition. Her healing was not dependent on his awakening. If he grew, it was his path. If he didn't, it was still hers. The polarity between them was shifting from dependency to divinity, from projection to presence, from see me to I see. The mirror between masculine and feminine had changed. Where once each sought reflection in the other, now each began to reflect themselves. He met his feelings without shame. She met her strength without fear. And in that symmetry, even apart, they began to balance the archetype they had once distorted. The chase had become contemplation. The silence, communion. In time, he would reach out, maybe with words, maybe with energy, maybe only with understanding. But the outcome was no longer the point, because what she had given him, through absence, was the most sacred gift a feminine soul can give, the invitation to meet himself. And what she had given herself, through letting go, was the only love that never abandons, self-love anchored in awareness. The universe moves differently around two souls that have learned their own gravity. There is no more chasing, only orbiting. No more begging, only being. No more projection, only presence. The mirror of the masculine is not meant to complete the feminine. It is meant to awaken her. And in awakening her, it must awaken itself. There comes a moment when silence stops being a punishment and becomes a sanctuary. When the woman, weary from chasing shadows, finally stops running, not out of defeat, but out of revelation. It is here, in this vast stillness, that she begins to see what was hidden beneath all her reaching. He does not disappear when she stops calling. He lingers in the edges of her mind, but his figure begins to blur. No longer the giant she once thought he was, no longer the sun she revolved around. She sees him now for what he always was, a mirror fragment, reflecting back her own hunger for love. Carl Jung once wrote that we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises. This is one of them. The man she chased was not merely a man. He was her own animus made flesh, the inner masculine energy that she projected outward because she did not yet trust it within herself. She believed he held the power to choose, to act, to decide, to lead. But when she stops chasing, she begins to sense that the true masculine, the one she longs for, lives quietly inside her, waiting to awaken. This is the descent, the journey from illusion to integration. It is not comfortable. It feels like loss, like something sacred has been ripped away. Yet in this emptiness, the real alchemy begins. She starts to observe how her longing was never about him. It was about her own split, the distance between her soft, intuitive feminine and her exiled, untrusted masculine. In Jungian language, this is the beginning of individuation, when the psyche, tired of fragmentation, begins its slow march toward wholeness. But the soul rarely ascends without first descending. He feels it too, though he cannot name it. When she stops chasing, something inside him becomes unsettled. The quiet that used to comfort him now scratches at the edges of his confidence. He wonders where her eyes went, the ones that once followed him like worship. He tells himself he prefers the freedom, the space. But soon, the absence starts to echo louder than her presence ever did. Men, too, are haunted by their projections, though they rarely realize it. The woman he ignored was, for him, a mirror of his anima, the inner feminine he has repressed in his pursuit of control. When she withdraws, he is forced to feel the barren landscape of his own emotional world. And though his pride resists, his soul begins to stir, not because she is gone, but because her silence reveals what he cannot escape within himself. This is how nature balances what ego separates. When the woman stops chasing, the man must meet his own emptiness. When she ceases to pour her energy outward, she reclaims it inward, and that shift begins to alter the invisible dynamics between them. In the language of the unconscious, energy always seeks equilibrium. Chasing creates imbalance. Detachment restores harmony. What she once pursued in desperation now starts to approach her, not because of manipulation, but because energy, once withdrawn, becomes magnetic again. Yet this time, she does not wait by the window. She does not check her phone, does not wonder if he thinks of her. She has descended into herself, into the dark well of her own being. There, she meets the part of her that she abandoned long ago, the child who learned that love must be earned, that presence must be proven. She looks into that child's eyes, trembling but honest, and whispers, "You don't need to run anymore." And in that whisper, something ancient begins to shift. This is not self-help. It is soul work. It is the woman confronting her deepest wound, the wound of being unseen, unheard, unchosen, and realizing that her worth never needed validation to exist. The modern world teaches her to chase, to perform, to prove her value through pursuit. But the psyche knows that love cannot bloom in desperation. Real connection thrives only in freedom, and freedom is born from self-possession. There is a peculiar calm that follows emotional withdrawal, a quiet reordering of priorities. She notices her world expanding again, the taste of morning tea, the sound of rain against glass, the soft hum of her own breath. Small pleasures return as if they were waiting for her to stop looking elsewhere. This is the feminine rerouting into being rather than seeking. She begins to feel the rhythm of her own energy, cyclical, intuitive, unhurried. In Jungian psychology, this is the return to the self, the center that holds all opposites. It does not chase. It simply attracts what resonates. The man senses the shift. At first, he interprets it as distance, maybe even rejection. But over time, the silence becomes unbearable in its dignity. He realizes she is not punishing him. She is simply gone, withdrawn from the illusion. Her energy no longer orbits him, and that loss of gravitational pull disorients his ego. Men often awaken not through confrontation, but through absence. When her attention disappears, he begins to question why it mattered so much. What was it about her that lingered beyond her presence? He starts to feel, truly feel, the depth of what she offered. Not the texts or gestures, but the quiet emotional current she carried beneath her words. In the stillness, her value becomes undeniable. The woman, however, no longer measures herself through his recognition. She has descended too far to return to the surface illusions. In the underworld of her psyche, she learns to sit with her shadows, her jealousy, her fear, her ache to be chosen, not as enemies, but as messengers. Each shadow carries a piece of her power, once denied, now returning home. She sees how her chasing was not love, but avoidance, a way to distract herself from her own inner emptiness. She mistook urgency for passion, anxiety for connection. But now, in the sacred pause, she discovers what love truly is, not pursuit, but presence. To stop chasing is not to stop loving. It is to love without attachment, to hold the essence of another in one's heart without trying to control how it unfolds. This is the mature feminine, grounded, receptive, radiant in her stillness. And in that stillness, she begins to attract not only men but miracles. The descent teaches her something the surface never could, that what she was looking for in him was never lost, only projected. She realizes the most intimate relationship she will ever have is with her own soul. Every man she has ever loved, every heartbreak she has endured, was an invitation to meet a forgotten part of herself. The man she chased awakened her fire. The man who ignored her revealed her shadows. The silence that followed returned her to her center. This is how the psyche orchestrates growth, through contrast, through longing, through loss. The ego calls it pain. The soul calls it initiation. When a woman stops chasing, she is not rejecting love, she is aligning with it. She is no longer trying to get affection, she becomes affection embodied. She no longer begs to be seen, she sees herself so clearly that her presence alone commands respect. In this awakened state, her energy becomes subtler but stronger. It no longer screams, it whispers. It no longer reaches, it radiates. Men feel it, not as pursuit but as gravity. They find themselves drawn, though they cannot explain why. It is not her beauty or her words, but the quiet certainty of a woman who has met herself and is no longer afraid of her own solitude. And yet, she does not chase even when he returns. For she has learned that love offered freely is more powerful than love demanded. If he comes back, he must come as an equal, not as a savior, not as a possession, but as a mirror walking beside her. Anything less no longer feels like love. It feels like distortion. Her power now lies in discernment, not in desire. She chooses peace over performance, alignment over attention. Her heart remains open, but her boundaries have become sacred ground. In this silence between her and him, something ancient rebalances. The feminine that once pursued now becomes the force that receives. The masculine that once fled begins to seek. Not because she manipulated the dynamic, but because the natural order has returned. When the feminine stands still, the masculine finds his direction. When she embodies her worth, he remembers his purpose. This is the dance of polarity restored through consciousness. It was never about winning or losing, getting or keeping. It was always about remembering who she was before the world told her to chase. And in that remembrance, the old story dissolves. The woman becomes whole. The man begins to awaken. And between them, not control, but connection, quietly begins to grow. There is a quiet kind of power that comes after letting go. Not the power that demands or dominates, but the one that simply is. It moves through her like breath, like tide, unforced, undeniable. Days pass, yet she feels lighter. The weight that once lived on her chest, the anxious hum of waiting, the constant vigilance of the heart, begins to dissolve. She does not check who has reached out, or who has noticed her absence. For the first time, she does not need to be witnessed to exist. Her worth has detached from the gaze of another. And in that detachment, she rediscovers herself. This is what the mystics meant when they said, "The moment you stop seeking, you begin to see." The feminine, once scattered in pursuit, now gathers within her center like light returning to its source. Every piece of energy she once gave away, every text sent in longing, every thought looped around his silence, returns to her body. And the body, once starved of self-presence, begins to glow again. The man feels it before he understands it. Something about her absence has changed him. He cannot name it. It is not jealousy, not even loss. It is the recognition that what he dismissed was never small. It was depth. It was devotion. It was the kind of energy that could have steadied him, if only he had been ready to hold it. But she no longer exists in the same place where he left her. Her silence has become her transformation. Where she once reached toward him, she now faces herself. Her eyes no longer ask, "Do you see me?" They now declare, "I see me." And that declaration shifts everything. In Jungian terms, this is the sacred reunion. The anima and animus no longer at war but learning to dance. She no longer projects her inner masculine onto him. She has integrated it. She can take action without losing softness, hold boundaries without closing her heart. She no longer needs him to provide what she has cultivated within. This is individuation, the alchemy of becoming whole. It is not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like the deep hum of truth beneath the noise of the world. The ego resists such peace. It prefers tension, craving, pursuit, because those things feel alive, even when they hurt. But she no longer feeds that hunger. She has tasted something deeper than desire, contentment. And once a woman drinks from that well, no game can satisfy her again. When she walks now, the air around her feels different. She doesn't perform calmness, she embodies it. She doesn't chase attention, it naturally finds her, as rivers find the sea. Her energy speaks louder than any words could. A quiet confidence that comes from inner union. Men sense it. Some approach out of curiosity, others retreat out of discomfort. Because the energy of a woman who no longer chases exposes what others still run from. Her stillness is a mirror. It reflects who they are without her pursuit to blur the image. The one she once chased might return, humbled, drawn back not by nostalgia but by resonance. He may find himself haunted by the space she left behind, not the noise of her wanting, but the silence of her self-ownership. If he returns, she will not rush to fill the space between them. She will watch, not with suspicion, but with awareness. Does his energy match her peace? Does he come to meet her, or to take from her? For she has learned, love without awareness becomes repetition. And she has no desire to repeat what consciousness has already completed. The feminine awakening is not about power over men. It is about power with oneself. To stop chasing is to trust that what belongs will recognize you without being pursued. It is to know that love, when aligned, does not require convincing. It is to choose the quiet dignity of your own rhythm over the chaos of someone else's indifference. In Stoic philosophy, detachment is not coldness, it is clarity. To love while allowing freedom, to care without control, that is mastery. She embodies this now. Her empathy no longer leaks from her wounds, it flows from her wholeness. This is what Jung called the sacred feminine in integration, no longer the child seeking validation, but the queen anchored in self-awareness. Her emotions are not storms to be feared, they are tides she has learned to navigate. And as she navigates them, she becomes the calm in every man's chaos. When the man sees her again, whether in person, in memory, or in dream, something inside him softens. He realizes she was never chasing him, she was chasing her own reflection in his eyes. And now that reflection is gone, he finally sees what she truly was. Her silence taught him more about love than her presence ever could. He begins to care, not because she stopped caring, but because she stopped carrying the relationship alone. Her absence forced him to meet the emptiness within himself, the space she once filled with her constant effort. Some men return changed, awakened. Others move on, seeking another woman to mirror their unhealed patterns. But she no longer defines herself by their readiness. She knows that his timing has nothing to do with her worth. Her story continues regardless of his understanding. The deeper truth is this. When she stopped chasing, she didn't lose him, she found herself. She stopped performing the version of womanhood that pleases the wounded masculine and began to embody the woman who pleases her own soul. That shift is irreversible. She still feels tenderness when she remembers him, not as longing, but as gratitude. He was the catalyst, the mirror, the one who unknowingly guided her toward the silence where her true self was waiting. Every heartbreak, every unanswered message, every tear she shed became part of her initiation. They were not signs of weakness, they were the birth pains of awakening. And now she carries that wisdom like a quiet flame inside her. Not to burn, but to illuminate. In the stillness of her nights, when the world is hushed, she sometimes senses the old ache trying to rise. But instead of reaching outward, she places a hand over her heart and listens. The ache is softer now, less demanding. It speaks not of lack, but of memory, a reminder of how far she has come. She smiles. Because she knows, caring deeply was never her flaw, chasing was. And even chasing was not failure, it was the path she needed to walk to learn surrender. Her power was never about control, it was about returning home to herself. And in that homecoming, love finds her naturally, not as pursuit, but as presence. He may still think of her. He may still feel the ghost of her energy around him when he lies awake, wondering where it all shifted. Perhaps he will reach out, or perhaps he will remain silent. Either way, she no longer waits for an answer. She has become her own closure. Her peace does not depend on his recognition. She no longer needs the story to continue. She honors it for what it was, a chapter that revealed her strength. When love returns, it will not demand she chase or shrink. It will recognize her stillness and meet it with steadiness. That is how conscious love begins, not in pursuit, but in presence. The world around her remains the same, yet she experiences it differently. Colors seem fuller, time moves slower, laughter feels freer. She has reclaimed her senses, all that was once dulled by the noise of longing. She has become the woman who does not run after love, but walks with it beside her. And when others ask her how she did it, how she made him care, how she turned the tables, she will simply smile. Because the truth cannot be taught, only lived. She did not make him care. She stopped chasing, and in doing so, she broke the pattern that kept her invisible. Her stillness revealed her substance. And in that revelation, she became unforgettable. Every story of awakening ends the same way, not with victory, not with revenge, but with peace. Because peace is what the soul was always searching for beneath every chase. It is what the heart whispers for when it cries out for love. It is what remains when everything else falls away. She has found that peace now. Not because he finally turned around, but because she finally stopped turning away from herself. When she stands before the mirror, she no longer searches for who she was in someone else's eyes. She sees a woman whole, complex, radiant, the sum of every lesson, every ache, every moment of stillness. And she knows, the kind of man who can meet her now must also have met himself. For anything less would shatter under the weight of her awareness. This is the liberation. Not in walking away with anger, but in walking away with understanding. Not in needing him to care, but in knowing that whether he does or not, she remains complete. The woman who stops chasing becomes the embodiment of calm magnetism. She moves through life not grasping, not proving, simply being. And in that being, she draws toward her everything that resonates with truth. If he cares now, it is because she reminded him what care truly feels like. If he reaches back, it is because her silence called him into his own soul. But she no longer needs the outcome. She lives in alignment, not anticipation. The old self, the one who begged, who waited, who feared being forgotten, has dissolved. In her place stands a woman who has met her depths and come back carrying wisdom. The woman who walks away in silence isn't weak, she simply sees more. She sees how chasing love obscures it, how silence speaks louder than pleading, how stillness reveals truth. And as she steps into the world, unhurried and whole, the universe, and every man who meets her, must adjust to her frequency, because she no longer revolves around anyone's gravity. She has become her own center. And from that center, everything she ever sought begins to find her, naturally, effortlessly, inevitably.